Refined question list for pedagogical bridging. Conceptual clarity questions on the static/dynamic paradox in teaching. The Grant stack is static. Ordinance doesn't change, but animals move through time. They show dynamic flow of energy. For someone learning both systems, this seems contradictory. Explain how you would teach this. Are ordinance and animal movement describing different things, structure versus process? Or are you claiming that they're both true simultaneously? Why is this distinction important for understanding the person, not just the theory? I would say, technically speaking, or animals don't really move through time. It's just the layer that we're dealing with when we're talking about what it means to type someone, because clearly the objective personality foundation can get types wrong, or the formal professional typers can actually come to a decision that's incongruent with your lived identity, experience, reality, and that's something that can be projected upon you as a reflection of improper typing, which is never something that they claim to be able to do with 100% fidelity. They're just saying that over time they've honed their stance on what it means to type and what linguistic baselines they're using to convey these rules about a reflection of a psyche as mediated through behavior. So the Grant function stack is static. Ordinance doesn't change. But animals move through time. This is similar, but it's different. It's different in the context that technically they don't really, in the same context that when you start to differentiate your first functions, you kind of implicitly differentiate your last functions, because adaptation and compensation only has somewhere to go. Only, like, it's you're decreasing the surface area of movement that you can go, and we're already assuming that the Grant function stack has been instantiated, so you can either go left or right. You can either go left or right depending if you're a jumper or a standard type. So from that moment you start differentiating, especially with the second function, you really start to see that the animal functions have kind of been stabilized from a theoretical level. Now from a typing level, from an applications/practice level, they're running through their criteria in terms of charting off coins to be able to determine, okay, this person is this type because these coins signify these different permutations within the function substrate, so this implies the function substrate. That's what's going on, but that is subject to change because the typing procedure is subject to change, as well as the theory being subject to change as it underwrites the linguistic attribution. So explain how I would teach this. I would teach ordinance and animal movement as structure versus I'm saying they're both true simultaneously, but yeah, ordinance and animal movement are describing two different things. Ordinance is the stabilized Grant function stack. It's static. It's what happens in terms of adaptation and compensation at the earliest levels of psychic development. From the moment, like, we're talking developmental psychology when we're saying, what does a person do when they differentiate a psychological function? How do they pull them out of the ether in terms of differentiation, right? It's a combinatoric soup of psychological functions beforehand, and they're picking and choosing which avenue of directionality to differentiate. Whether they start with an attitude orientation first, whether they start with the function of consciousness first, or whether they start with a modality first. Each of those subsequent decisions creates a combinatoric tree that checks off where that energy is being localized and what the adaptation and compensation picture looks like as a result of those choices, be they unconscious or conscious. So in this context, we're talking about how I would teach this. I would teach ordinance as the grant function stack being stabilized in terms of most to least differentiated, 1 being most differentiated, 4 being least differentiated, and then animal movement as describing the process flow. It makes me think of a process ontology in terms of Whitehead, Alfred North Whitehead, and his work. That seems like an interesting distinction to make, but we're claiming that they're different things. The grant function stack is static. Again, from the moment you split 16 psychological functions, 8 psychological functions into 16, that's in fact saying that there are now 16 psychological functions. So the grant function stack permutations become 64 because it's 16 times 4, since there are 4 different modality criterias in terms of Z2 times Z2. In terms of Z2 times Z2, this is referred to as the Klein 4 group, which has been theoretically associated with the sexual modalities in the objective personality system. So I would teach ordinance again as moving from 8 types to 16 types, and from moving from 8 psychological functions to 16 psychological functions. Those 16 psychological functions, multiply them by 4, the Klein 4 group, the Z2 times Z2, meaning that from the splitter's functions, if you split the psychological functions in 2, that means the combinatoric permutations bloom from 16 grant function stacks to 64 grant function stacks. This has been associated with the Klein 4 group. What happens here that's interesting is that animals, they don't necessarily move through time, but they're reflections of psychic energy in terms of an energic property, in terms of on psychic energy. Energic, E-N-E-R-G-I-C, energic, meaning it links functions together. So let's take a classic example of an INFP, or an INFJ, or an ESFP, or an ESFJ. In this context, we've been using, for the previous videos, we've been using a ESFJ. We've been using an ESFJ, FESI, blast, play, sleep, consume. And we haven't included their modalities, so don't think that that's a real type in the objective personality system yet. But it's still a skeleton. It's still a skeleton. And we're saying that for this type, for this ESFJ, we're talking about a function stack with feminine FE, masculine SI, feminine NE, masculine TI. And the animal function would thus be, well, it's not what would thus be, but the chosen animal function in this example is blast, play, sleep, consume. Let me say that again. Blast, play, sleep, consume. So that means the animal function goes, that means the function ordinance is now right because it's fixed, it's structured. So the energetic movement in terms of its directionality is now moving from FE to SI. That's 1 to 2. FM, FE to SI. That's 1 to 2. FM, FE, SI. Again, blast, play, sleep, consume. This is a classic ESFJ. feminine Fe, masculine Si, feminine Ne, masculine Ti, and the first animal function is going to be 1 to 2 De FM SF blast. That's 1 to 2 because the Fe is combining with the Si. I repeat, the Fe is combining with the Si and producing blast. Play is the Fe combining with the Ne. So it's a jumper going from 1 to 3, and that's play. 1 to 3, Fe and Ne. Feminine Fe and feminine Ne. And then sleep means we're going 1 to 2, 1 to 3, 1 to 2, 1 to 3, 1 to 2, 1 to 3, 1 to 2, 2 to 4. That's where sleep comes in as double masculine sleep. Double masculine 2 to 4, ST sleep. SI plus TI sleep. And then lastly we have consume 3 to 4. So it's 1 to 2, 1 to 3, 1 to 2, 1 to 3, 1 to 2, 2 to 4, 1 to 2, 2 to 3. Oh, there you go. I got that wrong. It's not 2 to 3. That's impossible. Cannot be 2 to 3. That's a double, what is it called? Observer. That's a wrong distinction. So I'm trying to speak out the higher order combinatoric in terms of adaptation and compensation as a flash principle of like 1 to 2, 1 to 2, 1 to 2, 1 to 2. 1 to 3, 1 to 3, 1 to 2, 1 to 2, 1 to 3, 1 to 3, 1 to 2, 1 to 2, 1 to 3, 1 to 2, 1 to 2, and then just like that high frequency oscillation, and then compensation comes in, and at 1 to 2 it compensates for 2 to 4 in terms of sleep, and then we go back up the chain in terms of 1 to 2, 1 to 3, and then down the chain in terms of 3 to 4. So the last would be consume, FM, OENT, consume. So I'm claiming that both are true simultaneously. But generally speaking, the animal function is static as well. But in terms of typing, you might get it wrong. So during people's lives, their lives may change and the typing schema might change and reflect something new in terms of, hey, were you actually an energy dom versus were you an info dom? But generally speaking, it's supposed to reflect the psychological constituents of your lived reality and experience. So generally speaking, it's going to be relatively fixed because most people have an anchoring with their quote-unquote inferior function, their quote-unquote demon function, their least differentiated fourth animal, and that can be espoused as a reflection of libido and how it's allocated. So in this context, you're not really changing your animal stack over time, but they might get it wrong, and you might shift what that behavioral profile looks like over time in terms of where your issues are at any given stage of your life. On the static / dynamic paradox in teaching, the Grant stack is static. Ordonance doesn't change, but animals move through time. They show dynamic flows of energy. For someone learning both systems, this seems contradictory. Explain how you would teach this. Are ordonance and animal movement describing different things, structure versus process, or are you claiming they're both true simultaneously? Why is this distinction important for understanding the person, not just the theory? This is important for understanding the person, not just the theory. Because in order to understand the person, you have to understand what makes up the ontological primitives of their psyche. That's what the grant function stack implies. And then you take a look at their lived experience and what realities they're living through, the behavioral expression of how those functions manifest in terms of their actions, their animal functions, their action functions, all the different synonyms to describe what this energic experience is like as a reflection of linking psychological functions as a mode of differentiation, as a characteristic of differentiation. When Jung first described functions, he was ontologically discriminating them in terms of differentiating them so as to not imply that they're in any way connected. But we now recognize psychological functions as having a higher order combinatoric that is a reflection of one's psyche to the extent that it's useful in typing. So that usefulness implies its reflection as a energic principle when relating to, all of these are hypostatized anyway. We're not saying that there are these functions as ontological primitives necessary. We're just using that as a descriptive nomenclature to be able to say, okay, so what are we talking about in terms of ontoclean? In terms of ontological engineering, what are we actually talking about? And that's why this distinction is important for understanding the person, not just the theory, so that we can go into and discuss and mediate what is a person's lived experience based on these psychological functions, and how can we track these psychological functions over time in order to build up a characterization of what we would think of as these principles in form or in function. On the static/dynamic paradox in teaching. The grant stack is static. Ordinance does not change. But animals move through time. They show dynamic flow of energy. For someone learning both systems, this seems contradictory. Explain how you would teach this. Are ordinance and the animal movement describing different things, structure versus process, or are you claiming they're both true simultaneously? Why is this distinction important for the understanding of the person, not just the theory?